December 17, 1945. Kraków Main Station, Belgium, occupied Poland. The snow fell in thick curtains through the pine trees as Second Lieutenant Hans Weber crouched behind a disabled American barriers, waiting for permission to board the last civilian train heading west before Soviet forces closed the escape of the surrounded 106th Most carry a single suitcase 3 kilometers to the east. Some carry children 23 years old. All carry the weight of knowing that this train represents the difference between life and whatever comes after the Red Army arrives. Dr. Helena Kowalska stands at the barrier with forged Red Cross credentials commissioned as an intelligence officer in the Wehrmacht. She is 31 years old. Weber had spent 6 months translating captured American documents. Her real profession was teaching literature at the Jagiellonian University Divisional before the occupation authorities closed it in 1939. This was his first combat assignment. The credentials she wears were created 3 days ago in the basement of the Ardennes shop on Hitler's final gamble to using stolen official stamps and paper salvaged from abandoned government offices. The offensive had begun 2 days earlier on December 16, 4 days earlier. 0530 hours. All non-essential civilians must leave Krakow opened with a barrage along an 80-kilometer front. Prepares defensive positions. 8 infantry divisions and 3 panzer divisions had struck. Priority for train evacuation will be given to German by inexperienced troops and exhausted veteran medical personnel. Line for rest. Everyone else must make their own arrangements or face whatever fate arrives with the Red Army. American defensive positions collapsed within hours. She would survive the war. Entire regiments survival was something that happened to other people in other circumstances. Soldiers and refugees. But here she stands with Weber's credentials that feel like tissue in her pocket, division, watching SS guards 25 kilometers in the platform entrance, watching families turn away, watching children cry because the adults supply lines cannot explain why they must stay behind in a city about to become a battlefield. Units lost the temperature is minus 12 degrees Celsius. Weber found himself attached to clouds in the frigid air, pushing west through the forest toward the town and presses forward each time the guards open the barrier to admit another supposed to follow. Some people have been waiting since dawn. The advance. It is now the temperature had dropped to minus 15 degrees Celsius. The train is scheduled to depart at 1,400 Vehicles froze. There are 400 seats on the train. The snow intensified until visibility dropped to less than 20 meters. Helena was approached 2 weeks ago by a man she had never met. Shelter in a small village. The man identified himself as part of a network helping people leave occupied territories. 37 men huddled in 2 farmhouses on the eastern edge of the village. He asked if she would be willing to use certain documents to help families board evacuation trains. Their body heat barely warming the documents would identify her as a medical officer authorized to transport patients westward. The plan called for German forces to reach the Meuse refugees who had no other means of escape. Toward Antwerp. Helena said once yes without asking questions. The British and American armies would be split. No longer existed. The northern half would be cut off from supplies and forced to surrender. The man gave her the forged credentials and the West would turn in Germany's favor. Present yourself at the train station on the day of evacuation. That was the credentials prominently. Weber had doubts. Bring medical supplies if possible. He had read the intelligence reports. Select families with young children. American forces in Europe numbered over 2 million men. Do not hesitate. German forces were down to less than 700,000 to respond to authority more than to compassion. American supply lines were robust. Act like you belong there and they will believe German logistics were collapsing. Helena brought medical supplies from the University Chemistry Laboratory. The Americans controlled the skies. The occupation began. Even with the element of surprise, even with the advantage of weather preventing American air so mostly empty, the offensive seemed impossible. She packed them in a leather medical bag orders that belonged to her father before he died of typhus in 1943. He conducted his duties. The bag gives her legitimacy. He translated documents. The supplies inside are mostly useless, but the bag itself is real and that is what matters. Showing American defensive positions. She watches the SS guards examine papers. He did not question the strategic wisdom of the operation. One guard is tall and methodical. That was not his role. He reads every line of every document. On December 17th, he asks questions slightly. He sends people away. Company commander, Captain Friedrich. The other guard is shorter and appears to probe west toward St. He glances at documents and waves assigned to accompany a squad of 8 men. Helena studies their patterns. Their mission was to locate which guard represents her best chance and which represents certain report back by radio if possible. At 1,230 hours, moved out at 0900 hours. The tall guard soldiers in winter camouflage moving through deep snow between the pine trees. Her legs feel disconnected from her body for the crunch of boots and the distant rumble of artillery. The guard examined a Walther P-38 pistol. He looks at her face, binoculars, then at the photograph on the credentials, and a notebook. The photograph was taken 6 months ago by the same leather glove that produced the document cap under his helmet. It shows Helena in medical whites with her hair pulled back, looking stern and professional, watching for American patrols. She has styled her hair the same way today. The squad leader asks where she is transporting patients. Was a veteran of the Eastern Front. Helena says Breslau, which is the next major city on the train route. 3 years of combat experience. The guard asks what medical conditions the patients have. With practiced caution. Helena says mixed trauma cases from air signs of enemy activity. Children requiring specialized treatment not available in Krakow. He was not a combat soldier. He is trained in emphasized languages and intelligence analysis. He does not question infantry tactics. The guard waves her, but he knew enough to stay quiet. Helena walks onto the platform toward the train. The patrol
Each
covered
step
2
feels like
kilometers
walking
in
through
3
water.
hours. She
The
expects
snow
someone
made
to call her
progress
back,
difficult.
to question her credentials,
They stopped frequently
to expose
to rest and
forgery.
observe.
No one
Weber
calls.
glassed the terrain with his
She reaches
binoculars
the train
but saw
and climbs
nothing
aboard.
except trees and snow. At 1,200 hours, they heard engines. American vehicles. The sound came from the west, growing louder. Becker signaled the patrol to take cover. Weber dropped behind a fallen log and watched the road through a gap in the trees. A column of American trucks appeared, moving east toward the German lines. 6 vehicles, canvas-covered cargo trucks, probably supply vehicles or troop transports. The Americans were driving straight into German-held territory. Either they did not know the Germans had advanced this far, or they were desperately trying to reach surrounded units. Becker let them pass. The patrol was too small to engage. Better to observe and report. But then the column stopped. The lead truck pulled over. Soldiers began dismounting. Weber counted 20 men. They were wearing winter combat gear, carrying rifles and submachine guns. They moved with discipline, establishing a security perimeter around the vehicles. These were not supply troops. These were infantry. The train consists of 12 passenger cars and 2 freight cars. Ardennes Forest, the passenger cars are divided into compartments, thick curtains through the pine trees as Second Lieutenant Hans Weber crouched behind a disabled American half-track, 400 seats watching his breath crystallize in a frozen air while designated for cargo, but Helena has been told that some guards will allow people to ride in freight cars in positions 3 kilometers to the east, and if the people are quiet about it. 23 years old. Helena stands on the platform beside the train and looks back at the crowd pressing against the barrier. 1941. 1,000 people. Fluent in English, French, 400 and seats. Italian. She commissioned as an intelligence officer in the Wehrmacht instructions were clear. Prioritize families with young children, prioritize American people who die if they remain interrogating prisoners, prioritize those who have some chance of surviving the journey westward. This was his first combat assignment. The barrier. Operation Guard is now checking the Great Winter Offensive through the Ardennes. Helena shows her credentials again and says she needs to select patients from the crowd for medical transport. The offensive had begun 2 days earlier on December 16th at 0530. He opens the barrier and tells her to be quick about it because the German artillery had opened with a barrage along an 80-kilometer enters the crowd. 8 infantry divisions and 3 panzer divisions had struck. A woman with thinly defended American sectors held mostly by inexperienced troops. An elderly man shows documents from the line he worked for the municipal government. The initial assault achieved complete surprise. A young couple with an infant American defensive positions collapsed within hours. Helena's hands shake as she tries to make decisions that will determine who lives and who remains behind fleeing soldiers and refugees. She chooses a woman with a 62nd Volks Grenadier Division. The youngest is perhaps 4 years old in the first day. The oldest cannot be more than 10. Created chaos. The woman's husband is supply line stretched thin, imprisoned, or simply communications broke down. Does not ask. Units lost contact. She tells the woman to follow her and to bring only what she can carry himself attached because the other hands must hold on to the children through the forest toward the town. The young couple with the infant searching for viable routes for the panzer columns. Then an elderly woman with 2 granddaughters. But the weather had stopped. Then a family of 5 who show her documents. The temperature had dropped to minus 15 degrees Celsius overnight. Then more families froze, more children, more desperate faces in the January cold. The snow intensified until visibility dropped to less than 20 people. The reconnaissance company took her authority as a medical officer transporting waiting for conditions to improve. At the barrier, 37 men huddled in 2 farmhouses on the eastern edge of the village. He counts the people Helena has selected and asks why she needs 9 other soldiers, 50 patients on a single train, warming the space. Helena says the patients are related family groups requiring continuous care. The plan called for German forces to reach the Meuse River rather than scattered across different drive toward destinations. Once the guard was captured, the British and American armies would be split. He opens the barrier. The northern half would be cut off. Helena leads her group of 50 toward the train. The war in the West would turn in Germany's and orderly, following her instructions to remain silent and to board quickly without drawing attention. Weber assigns them to specific compartments in the rear intelligence reports. For American forces in Europe numbered more than 2 million men, but the compartments are designed to hold that many to less than 700,000 children sit on laps. American supply lines settle into their assigned spaces. German logistics were collapsing. The children are frighteningly quiet. The Luftwaffe was grounded. They have learned during the occupation the Americans control survival and noise is danger. Even with the element of the surprise, adults keep their expressions the advantage of weather showing neither American relief nor fear. The offensive emotions might attract unwanted attention. But orders were still patrolling the platform. Weber followed them. Helena leaves her group in the rear cars and walks forward through the train. He translated documents. She counts passengers. He interrogated prisoners. Each compartment is full. He prepared maps showing him have 9 or 10 people instead of 8. He did not question the strategic wisdom of the operation. Departs. That was
She
not
does
his
not
role.
know if this will cause problems
On the morning
later,
of
but
December
she knows
17th,
that leaving people
the weather
behind when
cleared
there is
slightly.
physical space available
The
feels like a
reconnaissance
crime
company
she cannot
commander,
commit.
Captain Friedrich
At
Holtz,
1,330
ordered patrols to probe
hours,
west toward
Helena
St.
returns to the platform.
Weber was assigned
The
to
crowd at
accompany
the
a
barrier
squad
has
of 8
not
men.
diminished.
Their mission
More
was to
people have
locate
arrived,
American
having
positions,
heard that this is the
identify
last train
units
out of
strength,
Krakow before
report back
Soviet
by
forces
radio
cut
with
the
possible
railway lines.
The patrol
The
moved
temperature
out at
continues
900
dropping.
hours. Some people have
9
been standing
soldiers
outside
inside
for 5 hours, moving through deep snow between the Frostbite pine
is setting
trees.
in for those without proper
The
winter
forest was
clothing.
silent except for the crunch
Helena
of boots
approaches
and
the
the distant
barrier
rumble
again.
of artillery.
The short
Weber
guard is
carried a
smoking a
Walther
cigarette and
P-38
staring at
pistol,
nothing in
binoculars,
particular.
a map case.
She shows her
and a
credentials
notebook.
for the third time and
He
says
wore
she
a
has
wool
additional
greatcoat over
patients
his
requiring
uniform,
emergency
leather
transport
gloves,
due
a
to
wool
rapidly
cap under his
deteriorating
helmet.
conditions.
The cold
The
penetrated
guard
everything.
exhales smoke and asks how
They
many.
advanced slowly,
Helena
watching for
says
American
50 more at
patrols
minimum,
or defensive
possibly
positions.
more depending on the severity
The
of their
squad leader,
conditions.
Sergeant Emil
The
Becker,
guard looks
was a
past her
veteran
at
of
the
the
crowd.
Eastern Front.
He appears
41
tired rather
years
than
old.
cruel.
3
He
years
says
of
the train
combat
is already over
experience.
capacity and there is no
Becker
more
moved
room
with
in the
practiced
passenger
caution,
compartments.
checking terrain.
Helena
Reading
says
the
the
landscape
patients
for
can
signs
ride
of
enemy
enemy
cars
activity.
if necessary because
Weber
what matters
followed
is getting
Becker's
them to
lead.
medical facilities in
He was
Breslau
not a
before their
combat
conditions
soldier.
become fatal.
His training
The guard
emphasized
shrugs and
languages
says
and
freight cars
intelligence
are not
analysis,
authorized for
not
passenger
infantry
transport.
tactics.
Helena
But he
says
knew
she will
enough to
take
stay
full
quiet,
responsibility
move
as the
carefully,
medical officer
keep his
in
head
charge.
down.
The
guard
patrol
shrugs
covered
again
2
and
kilometers
opens the barrier.
in 3 hours.
Helena
The
selects
snow
another
made
50
progress
people.
difficult.
This time
They
she
stopped
moves faster
frequently to
because the
rest
train
and observe.
departure is 30 minutes away
Weber
and there is
glassed
no
the
time
terrain
for
with his
extended
binoculars
decision-making.
but saw nothing except
She
trees and
chooses
snow.
families first, then
At
individuals who appear
1,200
most
hours,
vulnerable,
they heard
then
engines.
anyone close enough to reach when the
American
barrier
vehicles.
The
sound
selection
came from the
process
west,
feels arbitrary
growing
and
louder.
impossible and absolutely
Becker signaled the
necessary
patrol
all
to
at
take
once.
cover. She
Weber
leads this
dropped
second
behind a
group toward
fallen
the
log
freight
and
cars
watched
at
the
the rear
road
of the
through a
train.
gap in the trees.
The freight car
A
doors
column
are
of
locked.
American trucks appeared.
Helena
Moving
finds
east
a
toward
railway
the German
worker
line
and shows her credentials and
6
says she
vehicles,
needs access to the
canvas-covered
freight cars
cargo
for medical
trucks,
transport
probably
purposes.
supply vehicles or
The
troop
worker
transports.
unlocks the doors.
The Americans were
The
driving
interior
straight
is
into
empty
German
except
held
for a
territory.
few wooden crates stacked against
Either
one
they did
wall.
not know the Germans had advanced this far, or they were desperately trying to reach surrounded units. Becker let them pass. The patrol was too small to engage. Better to observe and report. But then the column stopped. The lead truck pulled over. Soldiers began dismounting. Weber counted 20 men. They were wearing winter combat gear, carrying rifles and submachine guns. They moved with discipline, establishing a security perimeter around the vehicles. These were not supply troops. These were infantry. December 17, 1944. The space is cold and dark and smells of machine oil and old wood. In thick curtains through the pine trees as Second Lieutenant Hans Weber crouched beside a disabled American near the roof, watching his breath crystallize sit on the frozen floor and arrange themselves to conserve methodical destruction of the surrounding. Helena tells them to remain absolutely silent during the journey because any sound that draws attention to occupied freight cars will result in everyone being removed from the train. At 1,345 hours, 15 minutes before scheduled departure, French, Helena makes one final trip to the barrier. Commissioned as an intelligence officer in the Wehrmacht 7th Army. He sees
Weber
her
had
approaching
spent
and
6
holds
months
up his
translating
hand.
captured American
He
documents,
says the train is
interrogating
full and no
prisoners,
more passengers
preparing
can board
reporters
under
for
any
divisional
circumstances.
commands.
This
Helena
was his
says
first
she has
combat
5 critical
assignment.
patients who will die if
Operation
they remain in
Krakow
Krakow
overnight.
The Great Winter Offensive
The guard
through the
says this
Ardennes,
is not his
Hitler's
concern.
final gamble to split the
Helena
Allied
opens
armies
her
and
medical
recapture
bag and
Antwerp.
removes one of the morphine bottles.
The offensive had begun 2
She
days
says
earlier
these
on
patients
December
require
16
continuous
at
beam management during
0530
transport,
hours,
and she needs authorization
German
to bring them
artillery
aboard
had
for
opened with a
humanitarian
barrage
medical
along an
reasons.
80-kilometer front.
The guard looks at the
8
morphine
infantry
bottle.
divisions and 3 panzer
He
divisions
asks if she
had
has
struck
additional
from a thinly
supplies.
defended American sector
Helena
held
says
mostly
she
by
has enough
inexperienced
morphine
troops
and medical
exhausted
equipment to
veteran
treat
units
multiple
pulled from the
critical
line for
patients
rest.
during the journey. The initial
The guard
assault
considers
achieved
this for
complete
perhaps
surprise.
5 seconds.
American defensive
Then he says
positions
she may bring
collapsed
5
within
more
hours.
patients but absolutely
Entire
no more
regiments
after that because
surrendered.
the train is already
Roads
dangerously over
became clogged
capacity
with
and if
fleeing
there is an
soldiers
incident
and
during
refugees.
transport he will not be held responsible.
Weber's unit, the 62nd
Helena thanks him and
Volksgrenadier
returns
Division,
to the crowd
had
one
advanced
final
25
time.
kilometers in the first
She
day.
selects 5 people,
The rapid
an elderly
progress
couple who
created
appear
chaos.
unable to survive the winter in an
Supply
abandoned
lines
city,
stretched
a
thin.
pregnant woman whose husband was killed in the
Communications broke
fighting,
down,
and 2 teenage boys
units
who have
lost
no family
contact with
remaining
higher
and no
command.
reason to stay behind.
Weber found himself
She leads
attached
them
to
to
a
the train
reconnaissance
and places
company
them in
pushing
the freight
west
car
with
with
the
the
others.
others toward the town of St. Vith.
The freight car
Searching
now
for
holds
viable routes for
55
the
people
people
in
in
a
a
space
that were
designed
supposed
for
to follow.
cargo.
At
At the weather had stopped the
1,355
hours,
the temperature had dropped
before to -15
Helena
degrees
boards the
Celsius
train
overnight.
overnight. She takes a position
froze.
in the corridor between
Fuel
passenger
lines
cars
ice.
where she can move quickly to
The
either
snow
the passenger
intensified
compartments
until
or the freight
visibility
cars
dropped
if
to less
problems
than 20
arise during the
meters.
journey.
The reconnaissance company took shelter in a small village called her medical bag, waiting for conditions to improve. The credentials have served their purpose. 37 men huddled in two farmhouses on the eastern edge of the village without incident that would require their production with 9 other soldiers. The train whistle sounds, barely warming the space. The locomotive begins moving. He thought about the offensive's objectives. The platform slides past. The plan called for German forces to reach the News River within 4 days, then drive toward people who were not selected. Once the port was captured, the British and American armies would be Soviet forces arrive. The northern half would be Helena does not look at them and forced to surrender. She cannot look at them. The war in the West would turn in Germany's corridor floor and counts her breathing and tells herself that 105 people saved is better than 0 people saved, even though 900 people left behind feels like failure beyond intelligence comprehension. American forces in Europe numbered over 2 million men. German forces were down to less than 700,000 in the West. American supply lines were robust. German logistics were collapsing. The Luftwaffe was grounded. The Americans controlled the skies. Even with the element of surprise, even with the advantage of weather preventing American air support, the offensive seemed impossible. But orders were orders. Weber followed them. He conducted his duties. He translated documents. He interrogated prisoners. He prepared maps showing American defensive positions. He did not question the strategic wisdom of the operation. That was not his role. On the morning of December 17, the weather cleared slightly. The reconnaissance company commander, Captain Friedrich Holtz, ordered patrols to probe west toward St. Vith. Weber was assigned to accompany a squad of 8 men. Their mission was to locate American positions, identify unit strength, report back by radio if possible. The patrol moved out at 0900 hours. 9 soldiers in winter camouflage moving through deep snow between the pine trees. The forest was silent except for the crunch of boots and the distant rumble of artillery. Weber carried a Walther P-38 pistol, binoculars, a map case, and a notebook. He wore a wool greatcoat over his uniform, leather gloves, a wool cap under his helmet. The cold penetrated everything. They advanced slowly, watching for American patrols or defensive positions. The squad leader, Sergeant Emil Becker, was a veteran of the Eastern Front. 41 years old. 3 years of combat experience. Becker moved with practiced caution, checking terrain, reading the landscape for signs of enemy activity. Weber followed Becker's lead. He was not a combat soldier. His training emphasized languages and intelligence analysis, not infantry tactics. But he knew enough to stay quiet, move carefully, keep his head down. The patrol covered 2 kilometers in 3 hours. The snow made progress difficult. They stopped frequently to rest and observe. Weber glassed the terrain with his binoculars but saw nothing except trees and snow. At 1,200 hours, they heard engines. American vehicles. The sound came from the west, growing louder. Becker signaled the patrol to take cover. Weber dropped behind a fallen log and watched the road through a gap in the trees. A column of American trucks appeared, moving east toward the German lines. 6 vehicles, canvas-covered cargo trucks, probably supply vehicles or troop transports. The Americans were driving straight into German-held territory. Either they did not know the Germans had advanced this far, or they were desperately trying to reach surrounded units. Becker let them pass. The patrol was too small to engage. Better to observe and report. But then the column stopped. The lead truck pulled over. Soldiers began dismounting. Weber counted 20 men. They were wearing winter combat gear, carrying rifles and submachine guns. They moved with discipline, establishing a security perimeter around the vehicles. These were not supply troops. These were infantry. December 17, Krakow's industrial outskirts at 1,410 hours, passing factories that were bombed months ago and never rebuilt through the pine trees. Residential blocks where windows were broken and behind a disabled Americans were street fighting during the occupation, passing checkpoint stations where Wehrmacht soldiers watched the train destruction without reaction because trains leaving Krakow are now routine as the civilian evacuation continues. 23 years old. Helena stands in the corridor and listens to the sounds of the train. The mechanical rhythm of wheels on rails. The fluent conversation from French and Italian. The commissioned as an intelligence officer in the Wehrmacht's 7th Army. The 55 people in those freight cars understand that noise equals discovery and discovery equals interrogating the train at best, preparing reports for divisional command. They maintained discipline. This was his first combat assignment. The first hour passes without Operation Walk dem Rhein, The train follows the railway line west toward Hitler's final gamble to split the Allied armies and slower than normal passenger service but faster than freight transport. The offensive had begun 2 days earlier on December 16th. The pace is dictated by track conditions, sections of line damaged by air raids, German artillery had opened with a barrage of navigation through active military zones, sections infantry divisions and 3 Panzer divisions rail security thinly defended American sector held mostly by inexperienced troops and exhausted veteran units pulled from the line. SS officer enters the corridor from the initial assault achieved complete surprise. He wears Hauptsturm for American defensive positions collapsed within hours. He entire regiments methodically, checking each roads became clogged with fleeing soldiers and examining papers. Weber's Helena watches 62nd Volksgrenadier Division. Her forged credentials remain in her medical bag first day. She considers retrieving them but decides against drawing attention by producing documents before being asked. Communications SS officer reaches her position. Units lost contact with higher she is a passenger or crew. Weber found himself attached to she is medical personnel escorting patients to Brest toward the town of St. Vith. The officer asks to see her credentials that were supposed to follow. Helena removes them from her medical bag and presents them. The officer examines the documents for perhaps 30 seconds overnight. He looks at the photograph, looks at Helena's face, fuel lines back at the photograph. The snow intensified until visibility dropped to less than 20 meters. She can feel blood moving through her The reconnaissance company took shelter in a small village which compartments contained waiting for conditions to improve. Helena gestures toward the rear men huddled in 2 farmhouses on the eastern edge of 11 and 12. Weber shared the officer asks why medical patients are riding in regular passenger compartments instead of dedicated medical transport. He thought about the offensive's objectives. Helena says dedicated medical trains are no longer running regular routes due to fuel shortages and military priority use of railway resources. Once so civilian medical evacuation must utilize whatever transport is available. The northern half the officer accepts this explanation without further questioning. The war in the West with credentials and continues his inspection toward the rear of the train. Peace would follow. Helena allows herself to breathe again. Weber had credentials survived official examination. He had read the intelligence reports. The forgery was good enough. American forces in Europe but the officer is still walking toward the rear cars. German forces were down to less than 700,000 in the West. Helena follows American supply lines of 2 cars. German logistics were car 11 and begin inspecting the Luftwaffe was grounded. The passengers in those compartments present their papers without speaking. Even with the element of surprise, the officer examines each document of whether preventing photographs to faces, the offensive occasional questions about destinations but and orders were or travel. Weber finds nothing suspicious because there is nothing outwardly suspicious about families fleeing a city before it becomes a battlefield. He interrogated prisoners. The inspection continues into car 12 maps showing American defensive positions. He did not question the examination wisdom of the operations. That was not stands at the door connecting cars on the morning of December 17th, ready to intervene. The weather officer challenges any of her selected passengers. The reconnaissance company commander, the intervention would require her to assert medical authority over the transport St. Vith, to claim that these passengers Weber was assigned to accompany a squad of 8 reasons, to push back their mission was to locate American physicians, credentials, identify unit medical terminology, report back by radio but the officer finds nothing that triggers his suspicion. Moved out at 0900 hours. The papers are legitimate. 9 soldiers behind him camouflage moving through deep snow between the pine trees. Even if their presence on this train required except for the cruncher who does not exist to authorize transport that was not officially approved. Weber carried a Walther P. The officer completes his inspection of car 12 and exits toward the rear of the train. He wore a wool greatcoat over his uniform, leather gloves, Helena's breathing stops under his helmet. She moves quickly through car 12, everything, pushing past passengers in the corridor, slowly, reaching for American just as the defensive positions. Cold air floods into the passenger car from the freight car was a veteran of the Eastern Front. The officer steps across the coupling and opens the freight car door. 3 years of combat experience. The freight car is dark. Becker moved the only light comes from ventilation slots near the roof. Reading the landscape for signs of enemy activity at the entrance, allowing his eyes to adjust to the darkness. He was not Helena reaches the doorway behind him. His training emphasized languages and intelligence analysis sitting motionless on the freight car floor. But he knew enough to stay quiet, move carefully. The children have learned not to make sounds. The patrol covered 2 kilometers in 3 hours. The officer placed his flashlight across the interior. They stopped frequently to rest and observe cargo crates. The Weber glassed the terrain with his binoculars. He asks why there are nothing except trees and snow. Helena steps forward and says these are critical medical patients requiring isolation from general passenger populations due to contagious conditions from the West. Public health growing louder. She says she placed them in the freight car specifically to prevent disease transmission to other passengers and watched the road their ability to receive medical attention during transport. A column of American trucks appear. The officer turns his flashlight on German lines. He asks what specific diseases-covered cargo trucks, probably supply vehicles, primarily tuberculosis cases with secondary infections. Were driving straight into German-held areas during wartime conditions. Either they did not know the Germans had patients are being transported to sanitary facilities around Breslau that specialize in treating advanced pulmonary diseases requiring isolation was too small to engage. The officer considered to this explanation. Tuberculosis is common enough in occupied Poland. The lead truck pulled over. Medical evacuation. Soldiers began dismounting. Illogical. Weber counted 20 men. Freight cars would be reasonable. They were wearing winter combat gear, carrying rifles. He lowers his flashlight and tells Helena that freight cars are not authorized for passenger transport under any circumstances, and these patients should have been placed in dedicated medical cars with proper facilities. These were infantry. Helena says she agrees completely, and the situation is highly irregular and not in accordance with proper medical transport protocols. The snow fell in thick, but given the emergency evacuation, Second Lieutenant Hans and the critical nature behind the disabled American made the decision to use available space rather than leave them behind to die. German artillery continued its methodical destruction. She says she will file a full report with appropriate medical authorities upon arrival on Breslau and will accept whatever disciplinary actions result from this irregular transport. University of Munich graduate. The officer appears satisfied with this response. 1941. He tells Helena to ensure the patients remain in a freight car and do not enter passenger areas. Commissioned as an intelligence officer in the Wehrmacht 7th Army. He closes the freight car door and returns to the captured American documents, interrogating Helena waits until he disappears into car 12 before releasing her breath. This was his first inside the freight car. 55 Operation people remained frozen in position. The Great Winter Offensive. They heard the entire exchange. Hitler's final gamble to split the Allied how close they came to being removed from the train. The offensive had begun 2 days earlier on December 16th. Others comfort her in whispers. Hours. Helena tells them through the door that they must maintain absolute silence for the remainder of the journey because if the infantry divisions and 3 Panzer divisions had struck further, thinly defended American sector held mostly by inexperienced troops and exhausted veteran units. The train continues westward for rest. At 1,600 hours, the landscape outside changes. American defensive positions collapsed within hours. Snow covers regiments surrendered. Bare trees stand in geometric fleeing soldiers and refugees. Small villages appear and disappear beside the 62nd Volksgrenadier Division. Some villages show damage from kilometers in the first day. Others appear untouched. The rapid progress created the war's geography is random and absolute. Supply lines stretched thin. At 1,630 hours, the train slows as it approaches contact with higher command. This is a major junction point where trains from eastern Poland can pushing west continuing west toward the town of St. Vith. The station is heavily damaged from recent air raids supposed to follow. Platforms, but the weather had stopped the advance. Buildings are collapsed. The temperature had dropped to minus 15 degrees Celsius, and the junction remains open because the Wehrmacht needs this route for military evacuation purposes. The train stops at Katowice visibility dropped to less than 20 meters. Guards patrol the reconnaissance company took shelter in a small village called papers at the station waiting for conditions to improve. Helena remains in the corridor. 37 men huddled in 2 farmhouses on the eastern edge of the village between her passengers and anyone who might question with 9 other soldiers. Their body heat barely walks through the train, inspecting tickets and transport authorizations. The plan glances at Helena's credentials and moves on within 4 days, then drive toward 1,650 hours. Once the port train departs Katowice, the British and American armies. The next major stop is Gliwice. The northern half will be cut off from supplies and forced to surrender. After Gliwice, the war in the west would turn in Germany's favor. German before the war, a negotiated peace would follow. Territory where Wehrmacht control is stronger and partisan activity less common. Territory where the question of whether 105 refugees have legitimate authorization to be on this train might receive more detailed scrutiny. German forces were down to less than 700,000 in the west. Krakow to Breslau is supply lines were 250 kilometers by rail. German logistics were collapsing. The train is traveling at 40 kilometers per hour with stops at major junctions. The Americans controlled the skies. Total journey time should be 6 to 7 hours. Surprise. Even with current time of weather preventing American air support, expected arrival in Breslau is approximately 2,300 hours, assuming no major delays from air raids or track damage. He conducted his duty inspections. He translated 6 more hours. He interrogated prisoners. He prepared maps showing American defensive during the journey, which might provide cover for the irregular strategic wisdom of the operation. 6 hours was not the SS officer who inspected the train of December 17th and disembarked at an intermediate station, reducing the reconnaissance company commander, Captain Friedrich Holz. 6 hours means 105 people might actually survive this journey if nothing goes wrong in the next 300 squad of 8 men. But something always goes wrong in war positions. Identify Helena knows this from 5 years of occupation if possible. Plans fail. The patrol moved out at 0900 hours. People
9
died
soldiers
because
in
someone
winter
made a decision
camouflage
3
moving
days
through
earlier
deep snow
or 3
between the
hours
pine
earlier
trees.
that seemed reasonable at the
The
time
forest
but
was
turned out to
silent
be
except
fatal
for
in
the crunch
hindsight.
of boots and the distant
She does
rumble
not
of
allow
artillery.
herself to hope that this train
Weber
will
carried
reach
a
Breslau
Walther
without further
.38
problems.
pistol,
Binoculars,
Hope
a
feels
map
dangerous.
case, and a notebook.
Hope feels like
He
something
wore a
that will
wool
make the
greatcoat
inevitable
over his
disaster
uniform,
more painful
leather
when it
gloves,
arrives.
a wool cap under his helmet.
The cold penetrated everything. They advanced slowly, watching for American patrols or defensive positions. The squad leader, Sergeant Emil Becker, was a veteran of the Eastern Front. 41 years old. 3 years of combat experience. Becker moved with practiced caution, checking terrain, reading the landscape for signs of enemy activity. Weber followed Becker's lead. He was not a combat soldier. His training emphasized languages and intelligence analysis, not infantry tactics. But he knew enough to stay quiet, move carefully, keep his head down. The patrol covered 2 kilometers in 3 hours. The snow made progress difficult. They stopped frequently to rest and observe. Weber glassed the terrain with his binoculars but saw nothing except trees and snow. At 1,200 hours, they heard engines. American vehicles. The sound came from the west, growing louder. Becker signaled the patrol to take cover. Weber dropped behind a fallen log and watched the road through a gap in the trees. A column of American trucks appeared, moving east toward the German lines. 6 vehicles, canvas-covered cargo trucks, probably supply vehicles or troop transports. The Americans were driving straight into German-held territory. Either they did not know the Germans had advanced this far, or they were desperately trying to reach surrounded units. Becker let them pass. The patrol was too small to engage. Better to observe and report. But then the column stopped. The lead truck pulled over. Soldiers began dismounting. Weber counted 20 men. They were wearing winter combat gear, carrying rifles and submachine guns. They moved with discipline, establishing a security perimeter around the vehicles. These were not supply troops. These were infantry. At 1,730 hours, the train stops at WWII station. This stop was not on the original schedule. Helena hears guards shouting on the platform. The train remains stationary for 5 minutes, then 10 minutes, then 15. No announcement explains the delay. Passengers in the compartments begin whispering nervously. Helena walks to a window and looks out at the platform. Wehrmacht soldiers are unloading supplies from a military freight train on an adjacent track. The supplies appear to be ammunition crates and fuel drums. The operation is urgent and chaotic. Officers are shouting orders. Soldiers are running. Something is wrong but Helena cannot determine what. At 1,745 hours, a railway official enters the passenger car and announces that all civilian trains are temporarily suspended due to military priority use of rail lines. The official says passengers should remain calm and wait for further instructions. Then he disappears before anyone can ask questions. The temperature inside the train begins dropping as the heating system loses pressure. Windows fog with condensation. Passengers wrap blankets around children. In the freight cars, 55 people have no blankets and no heating at all. The temperature outside is -15 degrees Celsius and falling as darkness approaches. Helena walks through the passenger cars checking on her people. She distributes what medical supplies she has: aspirin for headaches, iodine for minor cuts, bandages for blisters forming where shoes have worn through. She has no food to offer. The passengers brought their own supplies, mostly bread and preserved vegetables, meager rations intended to last until they reach Breslau. At 18:15 hours, SS guards begin walking through the train again. They are different guards than before, local WWII security personnel rather than the transport guards who boarded in Krakow. They move through each car systematically, examining papers, asking questions, looking for irregularities that might indicate partisan infiltration or desertion or any of the 1,000 problems that SS security exists to prevent. Helena presents her credentials when the guards reach her position. These guards are less interested in medical authority than the previous ones. They ask detailed questions about her patients, about their specific conditions, about which compartments they occupy, about why medical patients are riding civilian trains instead of military medical transports. Helena repeats the tuberculosis story and adds new details about patient histories and treatment protocols, improvising medical terminology based on her limited understanding of public health procedures.
The guards appear skeptical but they do not challenge her directly. They continue their inspection toward the rear of the train. Helena follows at a distance. When the guards reach the freight car, they open the door immediately without announcing themselves. Flashlight beams sweep across the interior. The 55 people inside freeze in position, maintaining the absolute silence that has kept them hidden since Krakow. One of the guards asks Helena to explain why tuberculosis patients are being transported in a freight car without proper medical supervision or quarantine protocols. Helena says the patients are under her direct supervision and she checks on them regularly during the journey. The guard says this does not constitute proper medical supervision. Helena agrees and says again that the circumstances are highly irregular but necessary given the emergency evacuation situation. The guard tells Helena that he is reporting this irregularity to his commanding officer. He closes the freight car door and leaves. Helena does not know if this means the freight car passengers will be removed from the train or if the report is simply bureaucratic procedure that will be filed and forgotten. She returns to the corridor and waits. At 1900 hours, an SS Obersturmführer, a lieutenant, enters the train. He walks directly to Helena's position and asks to see her credentials and her patient transport authorization paperwork. Helena provides the credentials. She has no transport authorization paperwork because none exists. She says the paperwork was issued in Krakow and remains with railway administration officials at the departure station. The Obersturmführer says this is unacceptable. Medical transport requires specific authorization documentation showing patient identities, medical conditions, treatment plans, and destination facilities. Without this documentation, the transport is not legitimate and the patients must disembark immediately. Helena says the documentation exists but was not provided to her directly because of the emergency nature of the evacuation. She says she can provide detailed patient information verbally if the Obersturmführer requires it for his records. The Obersturmführer demands a complete list of patients with names and medical conditions. Helena opens her medical bag and removes a notebook. She begins improvising names and conditions, mixing Polish names with German names, inventing case histories that sound plausible. This patient has advanced pulmonary tuberculosis with hemoptysis, this patient has tubercular meningitis with neurological complications, this patient has miliary tuberculosis requiring immediate sanitarium treatment. She fills 3 notebook pages with fabricated medical records while the Obersturmführer watches. The process takes 15 minutes. The Obersturmführer examines the handwritten records and asks why the records are handwritten instead of typed on official forms. Helena says typed records were destroyed in an air raid that damaged the Krakow Medical Records Office and these handwritten records represent the only surviving documentation of patient histories. The Obersturmführer appears uncertain. The story is plausible enough. Air raids have destroyed numerous administrative offices across occupied Poland. Record-keeping has become increasingly irregular as the evacuation proceeds. But something about the situation still troubles him. He tells Helena that he is confiscating her credentials pending verification of her medical authority and her patient transport authorization. He takes her forged credentials and leaves the train. Helena stands in the corridor feeling her carefully constructed deception collapsing. Without credentials, she has no authority to claim these 105 people are medical patients under her supervision. Without authority, they are simply refugees who boarded the train using methods that were not officially approved. If the Obersturmführer verifies that her credentials are forged, the entire transport will be exposed as fraudulent. At 1930 hours, the train remains stationary at Gliwice station. Darkness has fallen completely. The platform lights illuminate snow falling in the cold air. Helena walks to the freight car and opens the door slightly. She tells the 55 people inside that there might be problems ahead and they should be prepared to disembark quickly if ordered. She does not explain further because there is nothing to explain except that their survival for the past 5 hours was based on documents that no longer exist. At 2000 hours, the Obersturmführer returns. He carries Helena's credentials and a railway telegram. He tells Helena that he contacted Krakow Medical Administration offices to verify her credentials and her patient transport authorization. The offices did not respond because communication lines to Krakow are now disrupted by Soviet advances. Without verification, he cannot allow the transport to continue. Helena feels her mouth going dry. She asks what will happen to the patients if they cannot continue to Breslau. The Obersturmführer says they will be removed from the train and placed in local medical facilities until proper authorization can be established. Helena says there are no medical facilities in Gliwice with capacity to treat 105 tuberculosis patients requiring isolation protocols. The Obersturmführer says this is not his concern. Helena makes a decision. She opens her medical bag and removes all 4 morphine bottles, some still containing medication, some empty but appearing full in the dim train lighting. She says these patients require continuous pain management during transport, and if they are removed from the train they will experience severe medical crises within hours due to morphine withdrawal combined with their advanced tuberculosis conditions. She says she is willing to provide signed medical statements taking full personal responsibility for any consequences of continuing the transport without verified paperwork. The Obersturmführer looks at the morphine bottles. Medical morphine has value in January 1945 when supply lines are disrupted and military hospitals are running short of pain medication. Helena sets the bottles on a compartment shelf, not offering them directly but making clear that they are available if the Obersturmführer decides to allow the transport to continue. The transaction is never explicitly stated. Both parties understand perfectly. The Obersturmführer takes 3 of the 4 morphine bottles and returns Helena's credentials. He says the transport may continue, but if there are any further irregularities or problems during the journey, Helena will be arrested and the patients will be removed. He leaves the train without further comment. At 2015 hours, the train begins moving again. Helena stands in the corridor holding her credentials and her single remaining morphine bottle. She has just participated in a transaction that saved 105 lives by trading medical supplies that were mostly empty already. She does not know if this constitutes bribery or pragmatism or simply the standard negotiation that defines survival in occupied Poland in January 1945. The train leaves Gliwice station and continues westward toward the German border. The next major stop is Wrocław, the German name for Breslau, approximately 120 kilometers distant. Expected arrival time is now 2,230 hours, later than originally planned but still within the same night. Helena calculates that if nothing else goes wrong, her passengers might actually reach their destination. But she no longer believes that nothing else will go wrong. At 2,145 hours, the train approaches the German border crossing at Opole. This is the formal boundary between occupied Poland and Germany proper, the line where Wehrmacht military administration transitions to civilian German governance, where documentation requirements change and identity verification becomes more rigorous and systematic. Helena has been anticipating this moment since the journey began. The border represents the greatest risk to her transport. German border guards are trained to identify irregular documentation, suspicious travel patterns, unauthorized passengers. They have authority to detain anyone whose papers do not meet exact specifications. They do not respond to improvised medical authority the way Wehrmacht soldiers might. The train stops at Opole border station at 2,150 hours. Guards board immediately. These are Grenzpolizei, border police, wearing green uniforms distinct from Wehrmacht gray or SS black. They carry clipboards with passenger manifests, transport authorization lists, official stamps. They begin moving through the train systematically, matching each passenger to their documented authorization to cross into Germany. Helena watches the guards work. They are efficient and methodical. Each passenger must produce identity papers, travel authorization, proof of destination and purpose. The guards stamp each document after verification. Passengers without proper authorization are removed from the train immediately and taken to the station administrative office. At 2,205 hours, the guards reach Helena's position. The senior guard asks to see her papers. Helena presents her medical credentials and explains that she is transporting tuberculosis patients to sanitarium facilities near Breslau under emergency medical evacuation orders. The guard asks to see her transport authorization. Helena says her transport authorization was issued by Krakow Medical Administration and should appear on the train's passenger manifest under medical personnel listings. The guard checks his clipboard. There is no medical personnel listing. There is no transport authorization for tuberculosis patients. According to the manifest, this train was designated for civilian evacuation only, with no medical transports authorized. The guard tells Helena that without proper authorization she cannot cross into Germany with 105 undocumented passengers. He says she and her patients must disembark at Opole and apply for transport authorization through proper channels. The process typically takes 3 to 5 days assuming medical authorities approve the application. 3 to 5 days at Opole border station means 105 people stranded in administrative limbo while Soviet forces continue advancing. 3 to 5 days means children sleeping on station platforms in -15-degree weather. 3 to 5 days means elderly passengers dying from exposure or medical conditions that might have been treatable in Breslau. 3 to 5 days might as well be forever. Helena tells the guard that removing tuberculosis patients from transport mid-journey violates quarantine protocols and creates public health risks that will expose Opole station personnel and other passengers to active tuberculosis infection. She says the patients have been medicated with morphine to manage pain during transport, and sudden discontinuation of morphine will cause severe medical crises requiring hospitalization. She says several patients are children under age 5 who will not survive exposure to platform conditions overnight. The guard appears unmoved. He has heard desperate stories from hundreds of refugees attempting to cross the border. Medical emergencies, family separations, urgent business in Germany, every story sounds similar after processing thousands of cases. He begins filling out removal paperwork on his clipboard. Helena makes one final attempt. She says she understands the guard is following proper protocol and she respects his adherence to regulations. She says she is willing to provide signed medical liability statements placing all responsibility for the transport on her professional credentials, absolving border officials of any responsibility for medical outcomes during or after the crossing. She removes her last morphine bottle from the medical bag and sets it on the compartment shelf, not as a bribe but as evidence that she possesses medical supplies and medical authority to supervise patient transport. The guard looks at the morphine bottle. Then he looks at Helena's face. He sees someone who is exhausted and desperate and also completely determined to continue this transport regardless of official procedure. He sees someone who will not stop arguing and will make his shift more difficult if he follows protocol exactly as written. The guard makes a decision based not on medical necessity or humanitarian concern but on administrative convenience. He tells Helena that he will allow the transport to continue under exceptional circumstances, but she must sign a liability waiver stating that border authorities bear no responsibility for the medical transport irregularities and that all consequences rest solely with her professional authority. He produces a pre-printed waiver form and Helena signs it without reading the full text. At 2,220 hours, the border guard stamps Helena's credentials and moves on to inspect other passengers. The morphine bottle remains on the shelf. The transaction was never explicitly acknowledged by either party. Helena retrieves the bottle and places it back in her medical bag. The train remains at Opole station for another 20 minutes while guards complete their passenger inspection. Several individuals are removed for lacking proper documentation. Helena watches them being escorted off the train toward the administrative office. Their stories end here at the border while hers continues westward into Germany. At 2,240 hours, the train departs Opole and crosses into German territory. The landscape does not change visibly. Snow still covers fields. Trees still stand bare in the darkness. But something shifts in the atmosphere inside the train. Passengers who have been rigid with tension for 9 hours begin to relax slightly. The immediate danger has passed. Whatever happens next, at least they are no longer in occupied Poland. Helena walks through the passenger cars checking on her people one final time. The families appear exhausted but alive. Children are sleeping in their parents' arms. Adults stare out windows at darkness moving past. No one speaks about what just happened at the border because speaking about it would require acknowledging how close they came to being removed. In the freight car, the 55 passengers maintain their discipline of silence even though the immediate threat has passed. They understand that survival requires sustained vigilance until the journey is completely finished. Helena tells them through the partially open door that they are now in Germany and the final leg to Breslau should take approximately 90 minutes without further stops. The train follows the Oder River valley northward toward Breslau. The river is frozen solid, its surface reflecting moonlight in narrow strips between snow-covered banks. Small towns appear beside the tracks, their lights dimmed according to blackout regulations. The war is present even here in German territory, visible in the defensive positions being dug along roadways, in the anti-aircraft batteries positioned near railway bridges, in the civilian evacuation columns moving westward on roads parallel to the tracks. At 2,345 hours, the train enters Breslau's railway district. The city appears largely intact from this approach, unlike Krakow which showed obvious damage from air raids and street fighting. Breslau's destruction is more recent and more systematic, Wehrmacht engineers are demolishing buildings to create defensive strong points, digging anti-tank ditches through residential neighborhoods, preparing the city for the siege that military strategists know is inevitable as Soviet forces advance. The train stops at Breslau Hauptbahnhof at 2355 hours on January 18, 1945. The station is crowded with military personnel, refugees from eastern territories, wounded soldiers being evacuated westward toward hospitals deeper in Germany. The platform is chaos. Nobody is managing arrivals. Nobody is checking papers. The Wehrmacht has more urgent concerns than verifying the legitimacy of civilian medical transports. Helena disembarks first and signals for her passengers to follow. They exit the train in groups, moving quickly toward the station exits before anyone can question their presence. The families from the passenger compartments blend into the crowd immediately. The 55 people from the freight car emerge blinking into the harsh station lights, stiff from 9 hours of sitting motionless on wooden floors. Within 15 minutes, all 105 passengers have dispersed into Breslau's nighttime streets. Helena remains on the platform alone, holding her medical bag with its forged credentials and its single remaining morphine bottle. She watches the last of her passengers disappear into the darkness. She does not know their names. She does not know where they are going. She only knows that they left Krakow alive and they arrived in Breslau alive, and whatever happens to them next is beyond her ability to control. At 0015 hours on January 19, Helena walks out of Breslau Hauptbahnhof into a city that will fall to Soviet forces within 2 months. But tonight, 105 people are alive who might not have been. Tonight, a fake medical pass served its purpose. Tonight, forgery and improvisation and desperate negotiation achieved what official procedures would have denied. Helena discards the medical credentials in a station trash receptacle. The forgery has no further use and retaining it creates unnecessary risk. She removes the Red Cross armband from her coat. She becomes once again a literature teacher who survived 5 years of occupation through small acts of resistance and careful adaptation to impossible circumstances. February 15, 1945. Breslau is under siege. Soviet forces have surrounded the city. Wehrmacht garrison troops are defending a perimeter that shrinks daily as Soviet artillery and infantry assaults overwhelm defensive positions one by one. Civilian evacuation has ceased. The railway lines are cut. Anyone still in Breslau will remain here until the siege ends in surrender or death. Helena is working in a makeshift hospital established in a former department store on Schweidnitzer Strasse. The hospital has no medical supplies beyond what was scavenged from pharmacies and military aid stations. There are no doctors remaining in the city, they were evacuated westward with military wounded before the siege began. The hospital is staffed by nurses, midwives, and volunteers who possess basic first aid knowledge but no formal medical training. Helena's literature teaching experience provides no practical preparation for treating wounded soldiers and civilians, but her experience with forged medical credentials and improvised authority turns out to be surprisingly applicable. She moves through the hospital wards assigning tasks, organizing supply distribution, making decisions about which patients receive treatment and which must wait because resources are insufficient to help everyone. The hospital receives a patient who survived a Soviet artillery bombardment that destroyed her apartment building. The patient is a woman in her late 20s with 2 children, ages 7 and 4. The woman's left arm is broken. The children have minor cuts and abrasions from flying glass. Helena treats the arm with splints made from furniture wood and bandages torn from bedsheets. She cleans the children's wounds with cold water because the hospital has no antiseptic remaining. While treating the family, Helena recognizes the woman. It takes several seconds to place the face, but eventually memory provides context. This woman was part of the group Helena selected at Krakow station on January 18. One of the 105 refugees transported westward using fake medical credentials. One of the families Helena pulled from that crowd of 1,000 people pressing against the barrier in -12-degree weather. The woman recognizes Helena simultaneously. She asks if Helena is the doctor who brought them on the train from Krakow. Helena says she is not a doctor, merely someone who had access to medical credentials and used them to help people board the evacuation train. The woman says Helena saved their lives. Without that train, they would have died in Krakow when Soviet forces took the city. Helena says they survived Krakow only to become trapped in Breslau during the siege, so perhaps salvation was temporary rather than permanent. The woman says temporary survival is better than immediate death, and besides, the children are alive now and that is what matters, even if tomorrow brings new dangers. She asks Helena if there is anything she can do to repay the assistance provided at Kraków station. Helena says the repayment is that the woman and her children are sitting here alive in this hospital instead of being buried in Kraków under Soviet artillery fire. There is no debt to repay. The woman insists. She says her husband was killed in the Kraków fighting and she has nothing material to offer, but she can help in the hospital if Helena needs volunteers. Helena assigns her to the children's ward where her experience with her own children will be useful. Over the following days, Helena encounters more familiar faces among the refugees sheltering in Breslau. A man she pulled from the Kraków crowd is now working in a hospital supply warehouse, distributing the limited remaining food and medical resources. An elderly woman from the freight car is helping in the pediatric ward, telling stories to children to distract them from the sounds of artillery fire outside. A teenage boy she selected at the last moment is carrying stretchers and moving wounded patients between wards. Helena realizes that her train carried 105 people westward and probably half of them ended up trapped in Breslau when the siege began. The other half presumably continued westward into Germany proper, fleeing ahead of the Soviet advance. She has no way of knowing how many survived beyond Breslau. She has no way of knowing if the train itself made any difference to their ultimate survival. But the faces she recognizes in the hospital suggest that at least some portion of those 105 people remain alive 3 weeks after the evacuation. March 2, 1945. The siege continues. Soviet forces now control most of Breslau. Wehrmacht defenders hold only the central districts. The makeshift hospital is within artillery range. Shells land nearby daily. Several patients have been killed by shrapnel that penetrated the building walls. The staff discusses abandoning the hospital and moving to a more protected location, but there are no protected locations remaining in a city under siege. Helena performs triage on a wounded civilian brought in after a Soviet air raid. The patient is unconscious with severe head trauma. There is nothing Helena can do with the resources available. The patient will die within hours regardless of treatment. She moves on to the next patient, a soldier with a bullet wound through the thigh. This patient can be saved if the bleeding is stopped and infection prevented. Helena has become efficient at making these determinations, who can be saved with available resources and who cannot. The process is identical to the selection she performed at Kraków station, choosing which people would board the train based on limited capacity and unknown dangers ahead. The moral calculation remains uncomfortable but necessary. Resources are finite. Decisions must be made. Some people live because others are allowed to die. At 1,500 hours, a Wehrmacht officer enters the hospital and announces that the garrison is surrendering. Soviet forces have breached the final defensive perimeter. All military personnel should report to designated assembly points for processing as prisoners of war. All civilians should remain in buildings and await Soviet occupation authorities. The hospital staff stops working. There is nothing more to do. The siege is over. Survival now depends on how Soviet forces treat the civilian population of a city that resisted for 6 weeks. Helena removes her improvised medical armband and sits against a wall. She has no energy remaining for anything except waiting. March 3, 1945. Soviet soldiers arrive at the hospital at dawn. They are from a Red Army medical unit, not combat troops. They bring actual medical supplies, morphine, antibiotics, bandages, surgical equipment. They bring doctors and nurses with proper training. The improvised volunteer staff is dismissed. Helena walks out of the hospital into a city now controlled by Soviet forces. She wanders through Breslau's destroyed streets, observing the aftermath of the siege. Buildings are collapsed. Bodies remain unburied. Soviet soldiers are establishing checkpoints and beginning the process of registering civilians. Helena considers her options. She can identify herself as a Polish civilian displaced by the war, which is technically true. She can remain in Breslau under Soviet occupation. She can attempt to return to Kraków if transit becomes possible. She can try to continue westward toward Germany, though crossing the new Soviet front line seems impossible. At a Soviet registration checkpoint, Helena provides her real name and her real pre-war profession. Literature teacher at Jagiellonian University. The Soviet officers show no interest in her wartime activities. They record her information and assign her to a civilian housing block. She becomes part of the occupied population, waiting for whatever comes next. April 1945. The war in Europe is ending. Soviet forces continue advancing westward. Wehrmacht resistance collapses. Cities surrender without fighting. The Third Reich is disintegrating. Helena remains in Breslau, now officially renamed Wrocław and designated as part of Poland under Soviet administration. She has resumed teaching literature, now at a Soviet-organized school for Polish children displaced by the war. The curriculum emphasizes different texts than what she taught before 1939, but the fundamental work of helping young people understand language and narrative remains unchanged. She teaches because she has always been a teacher and because teaching provides structure in a world where most previous structures have ceased to exist. One evening, a former student from before the war visits Helena's apartment. The student is now in her early 30s, employed by Soviet administrative authorities as a translator. She asks Helena about the wartime years, about how Helena survived the occupation, about what resistance activities she participated in. The questions are casual but pointed. Helena understands that nothing in 1945 is truly casual, and questions from people employed by Soviet authorities often serve purposes beyond simple conversation. Helena describes her work at the university chemistry laboratory during the occupation. She mentions organizing informal literature discussion groups that helped maintain Polish cultural identity. She does not mention the forged medical credentials or the train transport or the 105 refugees. The student appears satisfied with these answers and does not press for additional details. After she leaves, Helena considers whether the visit was genuine social contact or preliminary investigation. In May 1945, Germany surrenders. The war is officially over. Survivors begin the process of reconstructing lives from whatever fragments remain. Helena receives a letter from the woman with 2 children whom she treated in the Breslau hospital. The woman has relocated to Warsaw, which is being rebuilt as Poland's capital under Soviet-approved government. She writes that both children are alive and healthy. She asks if Helena plans to remain in Wrocław or return to Kraków. She suggests that Helena would be welcome in Warsaw if she wishes to leave Wrocław's memories behind. Helena does not respond immediately to the letter. She considers what leaving memories behind means in practical terms. The memories exist regardless of location. Changing cities does not erase what happened during the occupation years. But perhaps there is value in moving to a place where she is unknown, where she can teach literature without anyone asking about medical credentials or fake documents or desperate selections at railway stations. In June 1945, Helena writes to the man who gave her the forged credentials in January. She does not know if he survived the war. She does not know if he remained in Kraków when Soviet forces arrived. She does not know if he is still alive. But she feels obligated to inform him that the credentials worked, that 105 people reached Breslau, that some portion of them presumably survived beyond the siege. The letter is brief and contains no specific details that might be problematic if read by censors. 3 weeks later, she receives a response. The man survived. He is now working with displaced persons organizations helping refugees return to their home regions. He writes that the network that provided the credentials helped approximately 800 people evacuate from Kraków before Soviet forces arrived. He does not know how many survived beyond the evacuation. He does not ask for details about Helena's specific transport. He merely confirms that she did what he asked her to do and that this mattered. In July 1945, Helena decides to leave Wrocław and relocate to Kraków. Not to Warsaw, which is too new and too consciously rebuilding. Kraków, which has existed for 1,000 years and will exist for another 1,000 regardless of occupations and wars and political reorganizations. She returns to her pre-war city and finds it partially intact, partially destroyed, and entirely transformed by 5 years of events that cannot be undone. She does not attempt to reclaim her position at Jagiellonian University. The university is reorganizing under Soviet-approved administration and the literature department has new leadership with different priorities. Instead, Helena teaches at a secondary school in Krakow's Kazimierz district. The work is familiar. The students are earnest. The curriculum focuses on approved texts that emphasize proper ideological perspectives. In August 1945, Helena encounters one of her former passengers from the January train. The encounter is random, a chance meeting in a market where Helena is buying vegetables. The passenger recognizes her first and approaches cautiously, uncertain whether Helena wishes to be reminded of the wartime event. Helena acknowledges the recognition and asks if the person reached their intended destination safely. The person says yes. They continued westward beyond Breslau and spent the final months of the war in Bavaria before returning to Poland after the surrender. They ask Helena if she ever faced consequences for the fake credentials. Helena says no, the credentials were discarded in Breslau and never investigated. The person thanks Helena again for the train transport and then leaves quickly. The encounter lasts perhaps 90 seconds. Helena understands that both parties share knowledge of events that are safer left unspoken in 1945 Poland. There is no need for extended conversation or explicit acknowledgement of what happened. The brief recognition is sufficient. In October 1945, Helena learns that the network member who provided the forged credentials has been arrested by Soviet security forces. The charges are vague, something about unauthorized documentation activities during the occupation. Helena does not know if the arrest is genuine prosecution of wartime irregularities or political suppression of people who demonstrated independent initiative during the German occupation. She does not attend the trial because attendance might create connections that are safer left unestablished. The network member is sentenced to 2 years in prison. Helena never sees him again. She does not know if he survived the imprisonment or what happened to him after release. She knows only that helping people evacuate from Krakow resulted in imprisonment by the liberating forces, which seems like a profound injustice but also entirely consistent with how political power operates in post-war Eastern Europe. Helena continues teaching literature at the Kazimierz School through the remainder of 1945 and into 1946. She does not discuss her wartime activities with colleagues or students. She does not write memoirs. She does not seek recognition or compensation for actions taken during the occupation. She returns to the life she had before the war as much as anyone can return to a life that no longer exists in the form it once did. 1955 / 10 years after the war's end. Helena is 41 years old. She still teaches literature at the same Kazimierz School. The political situation in Poland has stabilized into permanent Soviet oversight. The ideological demands on education have intensified, but Helena has learned to navigate the requirements while still teaching students to think critically about texts and language. She receives a letter from Israel. The sender is a woman who was 7 years old in January 1945 when Helena selected her and her mother for the evacuation train from Krakow. The woman is now 17, living in Tel Aviv, studying medicine at university. She writes that she recently learned details about how her family escaped Poland, including the fake medical credentials and the tuberculosis story that allowed them to pass border checkpoints. The young woman writes that she has decided to become a doctor because medical authority saved her life when she was 7 years old, and she wishes to honor that memory by making the authority real through actual medical education. She asks Helena if this seems like appropriate reasoning for choosing a profession. Helena responds that any reason for studying medicine is appropriate if it leads to competent treatment of patients, and that authentic medical authority emerging from fake medical credentials possesses a certain narrative symmetry. They maintain correspondence irregularly over the following years. The young woman completes medical school and begins working in an Israeli hospital. She marries. She has children. She becomes precisely what Helena claims she was during that 9-hour train journey, a doctor transporting patients and managing medical authority in difficult circumstances. 1965 / 20 years after the war. Helena is 51 years old. She has been teaching literature for 26 years total, 5 before the war and 21 after. A historian from Warsaw contacts her about research into Polish resistance activities during the German occupation. The historian has found references to documentation networks that help civilians evacuate from Krakow in January 1945. Helena confirms that such networks existed but says she has no detailed information about their operations or their participants. The historian asks Helena specifically about a train departure on January 18, 1945 that reportedly carried refugees using forged medical credentials. Helena says she has no knowledge of that specific incident. The historian appears frustrated but does not press further. After the conversation, Helena considers whether maintaining silence about the train is cowardice or prudence or simply recognition that the story belongs to 105 people who survived rather than to one literature teacher who held fake credentials for 9 hours. 1975 / 30 years after the war. Helena is 61 years old. She retires from teaching. The school organizes a modest ceremony recognizing her 21 years of service. Students present flowers. Colleagues offer speeches about her dedication to literature education. Nobody mentions the war years because the war years remain a subject best approached carefully in 1975 Poland. After the ceremony, one of Helena's colleagues from the 1950s approaches privately. The colleague says she has a question she has wanted to ask for 20 years but never found appropriate circumstances. The colleague says her sister was on a train from Krakow to Breslau in January 1945, a train that carried refugees using some kind of fake medical excuse to bypass normal evacuation restrictions. The colleague asks if Helena knows anything about that train. Helena says she does not remember specific trains from 30 years ago. The colleague says her sister died in 1950 but before dying she described a literature teacher who posed as a doctor and selected families to board an evacuation train, and the description matches Helena. Helena acknowledges that the description might be accurate but says the events are too far in the past to warrant detailed discussion now. The colleague accepts this answer and never raises the subject again. 1985 / 40 years after the war. Helena is 71 years old. Poland is experiencing social unrest as solidarity movement challenges communist government control. The political environment becomes complex and volatile. Helena observes from the sidelines, no longer actively involved in public life but still aware of how political change operates. She receives a visit from a man in his late 40s who says his mother was part of a refugee group that evacuated from Krakow in January 1945. The mother recently died and left papers describing the evacuation, including a description of a woman named Helena who used medical credentials to help refugees board a train. The man has been searching for this Helena for several months and believes he has now found the correct person. The man asks if Helena will provide a written statement about the events for his family's historical records. Helena declines. She says that written statements about wartime activities create documentation that can be misused or misinterpreted depending on political circumstances. The man appears disappointed but understands. He thanks Helena for her wartime actions and leaves. Helena remains concerned about the visit for several days afterward, wondering if the request was genuine or surveillance-related. 1995 / 50 years after the war. Helena is 81 years old. Poland is now independent following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of communist government control. Historical research into wartime resistance activities has become acceptable and even encouraged. Multiple historians contact Helena about the January 1945 evacuation train. Some have identified her through documents. Others have received information from survivors or their descendants. Helena agrees to speak with one historian for an oral history project. The interview is recorded on audio tape. Helena describes the forged credentials, the selection process at Kraków station, the negotiations with guards during the journey, the border crossing at Opole, the arrival in Breslau. She speaks for approximately 90 minutes, providing the first detailed account she has ever given of the events. The historian asks why she maintained silence for 50 years. Helena says the political environment made candid discussion risky and besides, she never considered her actions particularly notable given what other people did during the same period. The historian asks how many of the 105 passengers Helena knows survived the war. Helena says she encountered approximately 20 of them in various circumstances between 1945 and 1995, either in person or through letters. She assumes others survived but dispersed geographically and she lost contact. She assumes others died in subsequent years from causes unrelated to the train journey. She has no comprehensive accounting because maintaining comprehensive accounts would have been dangerous during the decades when such information could have been used against people. The historian asks what Helena wants people to understand about the train event. Helena says she wants people to understand that survival during wartime often depends on small acts of deception and improvisation performed by ordinary people who possess no special skills or courage but simply the willingness to try something when circumstances demand action. She says the fake medical credentials worked because everyone involved, the guards, the officers, the border police, wanted to believe they were real because processing unauthorized refugees was more difficult than accepting plausible medical authority. The historian asks if Helena feels pride about saving 105 lives. Helena says pride seems inappropriate because she did not save anyone in any meaningful sense. She provided a method for people to board a train that was already leaving. Some of those people probably survived because of that train. Others probably would have survived by finding different methods. Causation in wartime is complicated, and attributing survival to single actions oversimplifies the complex circumstances that determine who lives and who dies. 2005 / 60 years after the war. Helena is 91 years old. She has been living in assisted care in Krakow for 3 years. Her health is failing. She receives visits from former students, from historians researching wartime resistance, from relatives of people who were on the January 1945 train. The visits are kind and the visitors mean well, but Helena finds them exhausting. A woman visits who was 4 years old on the train in January 1945. The woman is now 64, a retired schoolteacher herself, living in Germany. She has traveled to Krakow specifically to meet Helena before it becomes impossible. She brings a photograph of her mother, who was one of the passengers Helena selected at the station. The mother died in 1998. The photograph shows the mother in her 70s, surrounded by grandchildren. The woman says that family exists because Helena made a decision at a barrier on a January morning 60 years ago. Helena looks at the photograph. She says she does not remember the specific woman from among the crowd of 1,000 people pressing against the barrier. She says she selected people almost randomly based on proximity and apparent vulnerability and arbitrary judgments made under time pressure and psychological stress. She says she could have selected different people, and those different people would also have survived and created different families, and the moral calculation remains impossible to assess. The woman says this does not matter. What matters is that these specific people survived and created this specific family, and that outcome justifies whatever methods were employed. Helena does not argue further. She accepts the photograph and places it on her nightstand among other mementos from the past. 2010 / 65 years after the war. Helena dies in Krakow at age 96. The obituary in the local newspaper mentions her career as a literature teacher and her survival of the German occupation, but does not discuss the train or the fake credentials. The obituary states that she was a dedicated educator who influenced thousands of students over her long career. At the funeral, approximately 40 people attend. Most are former students. Some are relatives of train passengers who survived. One is the medical student who became a doctor and who came from Israel specifically to attend. The funeral is brief and the eulogies are modest because Helena requested no elaborate ceremony. She is buried in WWII Cemetery in a section reserved for university faculty members and intellectuals. Years later, historians estimate that the documentation network that provided Helena's credentials helped between 800 and 1,200 people evacuate from Krakow in January 1945. The network operated for approximately 6 weeks before Soviet forces captured the city and the evacuation routes closed. Of the estimated 800 to 1,200 people who used forged documents to board evacuation trains, survival rates remain unknown. Some reached destination safely. Others were caught by border guards. Others perished in subsequent fighting or in the chaos of post-war displacement. Helena's specific contribution was 105 people on one train during one 9-hour journey. The significance of this contribution remains difficult to assess. Those 105 people became family networks that eventually included hundreds of descendants spread across multiple countries. Those descendants pursued various careers, created various works, influenced various communities. The causation becomes increasingly diffuse across generations until determining what precisely Helena's fake medical credentials accomplished becomes impossible except in the most basic sense. Some people who might have died in Krakow in January 1945 did not die in Krakow in January 1945 because a literature teacher held a forged piece of paper at the right moment. This is what remains: the photograph on the nightstand, the audio tape interview from 1995, the memories held by descendants of passengers, the unmarked grave in WWII Cemetery. The fake medical credentials were discarded in a Breslau train station trash receptacle in January 1945 and no longer exist. The story of their use exists only in oral histories and partial documentation. The moral weight of the story remains unclear. The practical outcome is that 105 people boarded a train and some portion of them survived, and that survival created consequences that ripple forward through time in ways that cannot be fully traced or fully understood. January 18, 1945. Kraków Main Station. 1,000 people at a barrier. One literature teacher with forged papers. A choice made in desperation and cold, and the knowledge that doing nothing guarantees certain outcomes while doing something might change those outcomes in unknowable ways. the temperature -12 degrees. The train departing at 1,400 hours. The decision made. The consequences unfolding across decades. The quiet persistence of survival in the face of circumstances designed to ensure death. What remains is not the heroism but the fact that ordinary people improvise solutions using whatever resources are available when systems fail and official procedures become irrelevant, and survival depends on someone being willing to hold a fake medical pass and tell plausible lies to guards who have been trained to detect exactly those lies. What remains is the recognition that much of human history consists of small acts of deception that create space for continued existence when existence is under systematic threat. The fake medical pass saved a train of refugees. Or more precisely, a fake medical pass plus 9 hours of improvisation plus multiple guard failures plus border official pragmatism plus random good fortune saved 105 people from Krakow. The exact causation remains irreducibly complex. But on that January morning in 1945, when the train pulled away from the platform and the crowd of people who would not be saved watched from behind the barrier, 105 people were alive who might not have been. And decades later, their descendants exist because of a forged piece of paper and a literature teacher's willingness to use it. This is what wartime courage often looks like, not dramatic sacrifice but methodical deception, not heroic gesture but bureaucratic manipulation, not moral clarity but desperate improvisation in circumstances where all choices carry costs and no outcomes are certain. Helena Kowalska understood this. She performed her small act of resistance and then returned to teaching literature and never claimed the act defined her. The act was simply what the moment required from someone who happened to be present with the necessary resources when resources were required. The story has no triumphant conclusion because wartime stories rarely do. It has only the fact of survival, which is sometimes enough and sometimes insufficient but is always preferable to the alternative. The train departed. The passengers reached Breslau. Some survived beyond the siege. Their descendants continue existing. The fake medical pass served its purpose and was discarded. Memory persists in fragments. This is how history actually operates at the human scale, where individual decisions create outcomes that accumulate into patterns that eventually become the narratives we construct about wars and resistance and survival. Krakow, January 1945. The cold morning. The desperate crowd. The forged credentials. The train moving westward through snow-covered countryside toward an uncertain destination. This is what happened. This is what one person did with one opportunity and forged documents and 9 hours of improvisation. The consequences continue echoing forward through time in ways that cannot be fully measured but can be partially acknowledged. Some people lived who might have died, and that difference matters even when we cannot fully articulate why or how much.